Mouser Electronics is an authorized semiconductor and electronic component distributor focused on new product introductions from its leading manufacturer partners. Serving the global electronic design engineer and buyer community, its website features more than 5 million products from over 1,200 manufacturer brands. For more information, visit Mouser.com. All right, everybody. On this episode of the eDesignIt podcast, Brian and I are going to have a little bit of fun. We're going to talk about creativity with glass artist. Do you like to go by glass blowing artist? How do you like to be called, John?
I'd be an artist working with glass, or a glass artist,
All right.
Glass sculptor.
All right, a glass artist, John Sharvin. And John, you recently appeared on the Netflix series Blown Away, and you were showing off some of your glass blowing skills in all of these challenges. And another really cool thing about John is he originally wanted to be an engineer. But, we'll talk to John a little bit more about that. So thank you for joining us. We do appreciate your time today.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, why don't you just kind of pick up there and go back for us, to those days where you were originally on a path to becoming an engineer. What happened and how'd you get here?
Yeah, so in high school when I was, planning to go to college, I was always very, gifted at math and sciences and that type of work. Even though I always liked doing artwork, I kind of wanted to go pursue a career that would make me money and I could, buy a house someday and be comfortable living. And, everyone was like, oh, you're so good at math, you should be an engineer. Plus both my older brothers, they pursued engineering degrees at Vanderbilt University as well. And I was like, okay, yeah, this is seems like it's the path I want to go. And then I finally got into engineering school and I was like, this is just kind of boring, a whole bunch. And then, not that it's boring. It's just like, man, it's just all numbers, for so long. And my brothers were in, one worked for Boeing and the other one worked for DuPont. Then they both got laid off within a week of each other back in 2008 during the whole kind of, the recession, I guess we would call it. And so I was like, you know what? And they're like, you know what? I didn't have that much fun doing engineer. They went and pursued new careers as well. And I was like, you know what? I think I'm going to go pursue something different as well. So I transferred back to the Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio, and actually started, initially transferred there to be to go into arts education because I always loved my art teachers growing up and stuff like that. And my advisor up for a Saturday morning 6-hour glass blowing class for one of my studio series. And I thought that was going to be terrible. 18-year-old in college in the fall on a Saturday morning, I did not want to be in class. So, but after the first class, I was in her office on Monday morning and changed my major to be a Bachelor of Fine Arts with a focus on glass. I was just outrageously addicted.
Now, do you think there's ways to merge both on both hands, creativity and that practicality of engineering?
Yeah, there's, I feel like creativity has this interesting connotation to it. I think a lot of times where it's like, if you're creative, it means that you're an artist. And I don't, fully agree with that. If you look at someone who, look at mathematicians that have found very interesting solutions to math problems just by thinking outside of the box. And there's always different ways of approaching a situation rather than having to be very logical and linear, which is very important to have that. If you're trying to, bake a cake, you need to have the recipe, you need to have the ingredients laid out, but it doesn't mean you can't change them. You can't change the rules. Right. You can change the rules, but there needs to follow some sort of with the way my brain works a lot of time of having a very logical approach to stuff, mathematical, logical approach. I can deviate from that initial tangent. And that's, I think, where I find my creativity.
So I guess in essence, though, and from some of the research that I did, there's a lot of science in glass blowing in essence, right? There's chemistry and physics and maybe the melting is the engineering part, right? I mean, is that correct?
Yeah. So, glass is really it's a crazy material. There's a lot of science that goes into it. When we melt colors, you gotta, there's a recipe, but it's, rife with, you have your colorant agents, you have your fluxes, your stabilizers, a whole bunch of different stuff that goes into the glass formula to even produce your material first to actually then blow glass with. And understanding that compatibility, like coefficients of expansions and stuff like that, is all really, really important in the glass profession. You can't stick, two types of bottles together hot. They won't be compatible. They'll actually break themselves apart from cooling at different rates. Kind of if you, freeze a bottle, it kind of rips itself apart sometimes.
Right. So there's all the math and engineering that actually goes into that. I mean, even gravity plays a huge part in what you guys do, right?
Yeah, we use gravity and heat. It's gravity and heat a lot. It's always rotating as well. I mean, the glass is always falling to the, it's always falling down. So we counter the gravity when we don't want to utilize it as a tool by turning. That's the, keeps it on center is what we call it. And so it's got to rotate around that central axis continually, but we then use gravity to actually stretch stuff out. And because it's pretty much a liquid, it's a slow moving liquid, the gravity will form. And so we utilize gravity to the shapes we want to make, whether it be a long form or if you have a nice long tube and you want to squat it up some, you'll hold it up and have it fall back on yourself. If you want to stretch it out again, you lean it back down and it'll drop down to the floor, kind of controlling that. Gravity is definitely used, which is kind of an interesting way to look at it sometimes, I think.
Yeah.
Well, I was thinking maybe you could give us a very high level look at that process of glass blowing for those who really don't because I hear the term glass blowing. I know in essence what it is, but I know nothing about how it's actually done. And I figure maybe there are some other people who would benefit from that.
Glass blowing has been around for, centuries. But modern day kind of glass blowing where you're actually starting with molten glass, it's, that's been around since the ancient Roman times and a little bit even before that as well. But essentially the basics of what glass blowing is we'll melt a whole bunch of glass into a big furnace. It's a like a blast furnace. It's heated to 2100 degrees Fahrenheit, about give or take a couple of degrees, and that sits molten in a big, basically crucible, thing in there. Use long iron rods to steel and iron to get the glass out of the furnace. It's just the glass we use is formulated for glass blowing. It's a soda lime glass, so it has a lot of fluxes in it to make it very easy to melt and what we call workable. So we have a long working window with it. So we get the glass out of the furnace, and then we use air pressure, and tools to manipulate that glass into anything from a drinking cup to anything to like a walrus. Anything in between.
Which, if you saw, blown away, he made a walrus. I loved your telescope, by the way. From the engineering point of view.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. And so then, like, once you learn the basics of glass blowing, I always feel bad like saying this, but glass is really, really hard. It takes years and years and years to actually even be able to be to be comfortable with the material. It takes about a year and a half to actually be able to make a decent drinking glass. Once you get past the initial learning how to form the glass on a very basic level, then you can actually start using it. I kind of think about glass kind of like Legos or something like that, where you make parts and assemble them all together. So a lot of like prep, stick stuff together. And once you get a little bit more comfortable with material, it becomes a lot of fun to work in large teams to produce these kind of sculpture type objects.
Right.
How many different kinds of are there different varieties of glass blowing or different materials? I mean, is glass just glass, or are there different types
to work with?
Yeah, there's I forget how many Corning actually has on record. Corning Glass in New York, they have a big research facility and stuff like that. But there's thousands and thousands of different types of glass in the world. The glass we typically use in glass blowing in the hot shop is a soda lime based glass. A really familiar glass is Pyrex, a name brand glass. It's a borosilicate glass. It's more resilient with thermal shock. That's why your baking dishes at home are Pyrex. It's
Right.
They're very good at being put into the oven. If I made a baking dish out of the glass I use and you put it in the oven, it would just be shattered glass everywhere. It's not good at
Right.
quickly going up and down in temperature, but Pyrex or borosilicate glass is fantastic at it.
So the glass you guys usually are blowing is made out of, right, like sand, soda ash, and what else, right? Am I missing something there? Or is that it?
Yeah. Yeah, there's three main components. Glass, what was it? Glass former, which is silica sand. You have your flux, which is soda lime, and then your stabilizers, which there's everything from iron to what was it? Boric acid.
Gotcha.
What else is in there? I'm blanking. Yeah, I'm blanking.
Whole bunch
The glass we use, which is a spruce pine batch. A lot of chemistry. Yeah, it's like, well, once you add one thing to the glass, it changes its coefficient of expansion. So you have to alter that with another material to kind of stabilize that out. And then you're like, oh, this is a stable glass. But then you go to use it and it's impossible to work with. You're like, this is so stiff. I've melted bottle, bottle glass, a whole bunch of Rolling Rock bottles, throw it in a furnace and then melt that. And it's horrendous to work with. It's really stiff and it doesn't want to do any area. It's very challenging. So trying to find the right foam glass. Luckily we have distributors that do a lot of that for just our base clear glass. But then when you add colors, that's a lot of stuff that we all do in our private studios is glass with the base, base glass, basically adding chocolate to milk or strawberry to milk and changing the color that way. You can make it a whole bunch of different colors. Yeah.
So I have a question, right? Okay. So when I first saw this, I never saw this, like people really make glass until, I've seen it, but not really in depth until watching the show. Now, you guys, when you finish blowing your glass, you put it in an annealer. Is that the right word? Or I think that's what you call it, annealer, right? Where you would let it cool down slowly.
Yeah.
What's the difference between
Annealer.
that? Okay. What's the difference between that and a kiln? Because I was like, they're sticking it in a kiln. Is there any difference, or is it just like the word that you guys use versus what a kiln is?
Yeah, the difference between a kiln and a annealer. It's kind of, every annealer is a kiln, but every kiln is not an annealer. If that makes sense. Basically, our annealers, they differ from like is that the transitive property of equality there? But it's, yeah, I'm gonna have to like write up a math proof on it at some point here. But so yeah, an annealer. An annealer is specifically used to cool glass down. So the main purpose of it, it's digitally controlled to on a ramp down. So it's controlled very, very. Kiln typically, like most people think of kilns for ceramics, where you're firing up to a certain cone and you kind of like peek into your little window and you're like, oh, it hit, what is it? 4,000 degrees, like 4,128 degrees. That's when the cone slumps. You're like, great, turn the cone off.
Right.
We in glass where it's like we keep it at a certain degree and we have to slowly cool the glass down over an annealing schedule. There's certain points you have to hit on an annealing chart. You have your strain point, your stress point, and your anneal point. Those are all specific temperatures that you have to hit at certain time, or not at certain times, but at certain ramps. So we do degrees per hour, or per per minute. And that's the big difference between an annealer and a kiln.
So there's a lot more control is what I'm getting out of this. There's a lot more control in the way you have to deal with the temperatures, timing, and things like that.
Yeah, the timing is really crucial. If you can't just put it in there and turn it off, your glass will shatter. But then also, if typically I anneal something that's about a 1/4 inch to a 1/2 inch thick for about 16 hours. Now,
Okay.
that's a pretty
Wow.
standard annealing cycle for the glass that we use. But when you start adding different parts to your sculpture or it's really thick, you have to change the annealing schedule. It's not the same for every piece of glass. And every
Gotcha.
glass has different points of the glass I'm using up here. I'm out in Seattle, Washington, at a glass school out here. And the glass they use out here is very different than the glass I use in Pittsburgh. And the anneal point of this glass is 965 degrees. The anneal point of the glass I use in Pittsburgh is 900 degrees. They're just different points of that. Also, the annealing schedules are different. So the strain point of this, I think, is like 790 as opposed to the 725 of the stuff in Pittsburgh. So you have to like constantly be looking up like what glass you're using, and you have to know what you're using and know where the anneal points, strain points, and stuff like that to program your kiln effectively. If you have something that's like a bowling ball size thickness, it could take up to a month to cool that down without it shattering.
Oh my God.
That's great. That's crazy. Okay, so now I have another question, right? So is that why, like on the show, we saw some people assembling their pieces hot versus some people assembling the pieces after they were cooled down?
Yeah, the cooling aspect, that definitely goes into play on decision making. Sometimes, most glass artists prefer to do everything assembled hot assembly. I don't know if it's like this whole like macho, like, yeah, I'm gonna put it together, all hot, but it honestly is the preferred way of doing it because you're able to then manipulate it after the fact. I think John Moran talks about it very well in Netflix. It's like if you did, 2 hands holding something cold, you have to be outrageously skilled to be able to do that cold. You have to, have both hands separately and this object in the middle to all fit it. If you do it all hot though, you have time to kind of squish the fingers around it, and make it look more natural, adjust your stuff without grinding everything cold, which just takes hours and hours and hours to actually polish stuff again. So it's easier in some regards, but it's extremely difficult in others to do hot assembly.
Gotcha. So now here's my question. If it takes that long for things to cool down, you guys must have a really long filming cycle of the show.
So let's see, what can I talk about with that? I do have an NDA. I can't say too much about behind the scenes stuff.
That's okay. You don't need it.
What about in general? I mean, if you're creating artwork, what about how about these companies that mass produce different types of glass? I mean, what does that production cycle look like in terms of turnaround time? Could that really be longer than we've imagined?
Kind of. So it depends on what type of production you're thinking of. Actually, they're all kind of the same. Any large scale glass facility, they use a different annealing process called a leer. It's still annealing, but it's not all in one kiln. So basically with factories we'll just take bottles or mass produced cups or bottles that you'll get from IKEA or Target or wherever.
Right.
So when those machines produce those things, the bottle, it still has to be annealed. And it's put onto a big glass leer, which is typically they're about a half to a 1/4 mile long gas powered conveyor belt. So you put them in the hot side, which is that 900 or whatever degree their anneal point is. And then it slowly goes down the line. So it's constantly spitting out cold bottles at one end, but hot bottles are being put in on the other. So it's a continuous production rather than I'm done for the day, close the annealer, wait until tomorrow and then take them out. It's a constant production. And we all don't use those in our own studios because they're a 1/4 mile long and they're multi-million-dollar piece of equipment. So it's like, we're not going to use those.
Yeah, no, that's for like Coke bottles or you're
Right,
looking for
right.
like, glasses. Maybe you're buying at Target or
Yeah.
the store or whatever. Yeah.
Wow.
Coke bottles or even sheet glass. I don't know if you ever get the chance to visit a sheet glass facility, I highly recommend it. It is probably the most amazing places I've ever been. It's the glass ribbon, your window panes for your car, for your house. It's also done the same process, except the molten glass flows onto like a bed of tin, and that's how it's called float glass. But that stretch of continuous glass pane from the furnace side all the way through the Lear and out to the cold side can be up to a mile long. It can be
Wow.
really, really long. And it's a continuous ribbon of glass. This is one giant thing. And they cut it at the very end of it with a machine that it's constantly moving. And so to do a straight line, you have to cut it at an angle, and they have it all calibrated. So the scoring tool snaps across it at an angle, and then you get this nice square pane of glass. It's all automated and amazing. It's a fantastic place to go visit if you get an opportunity.
So this is a lot of stuff that we did not know about glass and glass blowing. But do you think that maybe there are, I guess, hit us with something that something that normally people don't know about glass and glass blowing, or the production of it, or whatever it might be?
Oh,
Any fun facts?
Let's see here. Yeah, a second. Fun facts about glass.
Or glass blowing, the process.
Let's see here. There's a lot. I think first and foremost, people don't think about glass as a resilient or strong material, but it is. There's a reason why we use glass in space and all this other stuff is because it's outrageously strong. Glass is inherently a very, very strong material. It has really good compression strength. And it's not good at impact, but it's very good at, it's very strong. When you think more about the properties of glass, that glass block window, we use that because it's very, very strong. It's very resilient. And people are like, oh, glass is so, fragile, and it can be in certain instances, but it has a lot of very strong properties about it as well. I think that's one thing that people don't realize, that how much they interact with glass on a day-to-day basis. Looking through windows, your phone, your windshield of your car. You're like, glass is fragile. It's like, it's your windshield. It's actually really strong. You know how many times you've gotten hit with a pebble in your front windshield and nothing happens to it? Let's see. Another thing about glass blowing. Essentially, when you start, and I think some of us talk about it in the show and stuff like that, but when you start a piece in the hot shop and you're working on a new piece, you have to start from, as soon as you start, you have to continue that piece. There's not really a good way of stopping. Typically, there are a couple ways of doing it, but it's very challenging to put your piece away and pick it up later. When I say this piece took 8 hours to produce or whatever, that's not 8 hours of a work day where you go and you take, water break and you go get your lunch or go to the restroom. It's no, you're sitting there for literally 8 hours every minute of that entire time working on this piece. And it's very, very intense. It's a full 8 hour experience. Think of it as an 8 hour movie, right? It is continuous.
Yeah, and it's 8 hours in heat. So, John, thank you for joining us. Can you let everyone know where they could find out more about you? Yeah, absolutely. First off, thank you for having me on. It's been a lot of fun. You can check me out on my website at www.johnsharvin.com or on my social media. I think my handle is Sharvin on Instagram. That's kind of the best way to follow along with what I'm doing. Well, John, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks again. Bye-bye.